Dive into VMware Cloud Foundation 5.2.
That's right. Let's take a look at the architect exam.
Perfect. So we've got the exam guide and the VCF 5.2 design guide.
We'll break them down for you.
Sounds good to me. So exam guide first.
Okay.
It says we've got 60 questions.
That's right.
135 minutes, which honestly feels like a pretty good amount of time.
That is quite generous.
And we've got to get at least 300 to pass.
300, that's the magic number.
And really cool, it says they give extra time to non-native English speakers.
Oh, absolutely. We want to make sure everybody has a fair chance.
Totally. And passing, of course, leads to the very impressive sounding VCF Architect 2024 certification.
Sounds good, right? And just a heads up, by the way, the exam's proctored through Pearson VUE.
Good to know. Now, the guide mentions minimally qualified candidate.
Right.
And that basically means 1 to 2 years of experience designing VMware solutions.
That's right.
But 6 months of that has got to be specifically on VCF.
Absolutely.
So this isn't something you can just cram for. You got to have some real-world experience.
Real-world experience. Yeah, you have to be able to take those business requirements, turn them into technical solutions.
Yeah, totally.
And think about things like, availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot.
We like to call that ANMPRS. It helps you remember.
AMPRS. Okay, I like that. It's like a little acronym, easy to remember.
It is.
And it also mentions that you need to be familiar with vSphere, VSN, NSX.
All the good stuff.
And the Area Suite, which is, that's a lot of tech.
It is. It's the nature of VCF. You're designing an entire data center.
Wow. Okay, so exam sections, there's 5, but this one only uses some of them, right?
That's right. You only have to worry about Section 1 for the VCF 5.2 architect exam.
Okay, and Section 1 is IT architectures, technologies, and standards.
Correct. You need to understand the why behind it all.
The why, okay.
How does it help the business? What problems is it going to solve?
That makes a lot more sense. Not just can you build it,
Yep.
It's why are you building it?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, Section 1 has some objectives, like differentiating between business and technical requirements, understanding different design models, and developing a risk mitigation strategy.
Yes, that risk mitigation strategy is very important. What could go wrong, and how are we going to deal with it?
Very smart. Okay, so let's move on to the VCF 5.2 design guide, which luckily was just updated on October 9th, 2024.
Very recently.
It's really up to date. This guide is really comprehensive.
Oh, yes.
It covers everything from network design for Area Suite Lifecycle to workspace one-access integration.
Yeah, it's pretty thorough, but there are some key things we're going to want to highlight for you.
Awesome. What should we prioritize?
The things that will help you the most on the exam and in the real world, of course.
Okay.
Like the VCF import tool. This tool can convert your existing vSphere environment into VCF.
Wow, that's got to be a huge time saver.
It is.
And I bet that's helpful for people who are already running vSphere and are thinking about moving to VCF.
Absolutely. And it's not just about converting the whole thing at once. You can import existing environments as workload domains.
So you have more choices about how you want to move to VCF. That's really flexible.
It is.
Okay. The guide also mentions VCF topologies. I'm not even sure what those are.
VCF topologies, that's just a fancy way of saying how your environment is structured.
Okay.
How does it achieve the availability and scalability you need?
Gotcha.
There's 4 main topologies.
Yeah.
You have single instance, single availability zone. That's the simplest one, but it's not the most resilient.
So if that availability zone goes down, everything goes down.
That's right. You have a single point of failure.
Yikes.
For more resilience, you can go with single instance, multiple availability zones.
Okay.
Now your components are spread out, so if one zone goes down, the other one can keep running.
So it's like a backup, but for entire availability zones.
You could think of it that way, yeah.
Okay, cool. What about the other 2 topologies?
Okay, so then we have multiple instances, single availability zone per instance.
All right.
That limits how much damage any one failure can do because you have multiple VCF instances that are independent from each other.
Okay, so instead of one big thing that could fail, you have a bunch of smaller things.
Exactly.
Like,
and then the most resilient, but also the most complex, is multiple instances, multiple availability zones per instance.
okay, so we're combining the benefits of multiple instances with the benefits of multiple availability zones.
Exactly. This gives you the highest level of protection against failures.
Wow. That's a lot of options.
It is. You really need to think about what's best for your needs.
Okay, so it sounds like Choosing the right topology is like choosing the right foundation for a building.
Yes. It's a fundamental decision that will affect everything else you do.
Okay, got it. The next thing is workload domain types.
Great.
And there's 3. Management, consolidated, and VI workload.
3 types.
So what are those used for?
The management workload domain is dedicated to the management components of VCF, things like SDDC Manager, vSender, NSX Manager.
Okay, so it's like the brain of the operation keeping everything else running smoothly.
It is, and it keeps them separate from the workloads, which is good for security.
Makes sense. What about consolidated?
A consolidated workload domain runs both management components and workloads on the same hosts.
Oh, okay.
This is a more efficient option for smaller deployments.
Okay.
But you don't get the same level of isolation.
So it's a trade-off between efficiency and isolation.
Exactly.
Okay. And then we've got VI workload.
VI workload domains are used just for customer workloads.
Oh, I see.
So this gives you additional capacity and isolation from those management components.
So if you have a really important application, you might want to put it in a VI workload domain to make sure it has all the resources it needs.
That's a great way to think about it.
Awesome. Now, the guide goes on to talk about VSAN,
VSA.
which is, of course, the primary storage for VCF.
Yes, VSAN is very important.
Why is that?
Well, it's cost-effective, it's easy to manage, and it integrates really well with the rest of VCF.
Okay, so it's like the perfect storage solution for VCF.
You could say that.
All right. And when you're designing for VSAN, you got to think about the logical design, the hardware configuration, the network design, and even the witness design.
That's right.
Witness design, no, what is that?
Witness design is for stretched clusters.
Okay.
Remember, those span 2 data centers?
Yes.
Well, the VSAN Witness is a small appliance that lives in a 3rd location.
Oh.
And it helps keep the data consistent between those 2 data centers.
So if something goes wrong in one data center, the witness can help make sure the other data center has the right data.
Exactly.
That's really cool. It's like having a referee to make sure everything is fair.
I like that analogy.
And then there's ESXi design.
ESXi design got to make sure your ESXi hosts can handle the workload.
Yeah, totally. So that's things like sizing, networking, and certificate management.
All the important stuff.
And speaking of ESXi, the guide mentions that you should use vSAN ready nodes for the management domain.
Ready nodes, those are great. They're pre-configured and certified for VSAN.
So it makes it easier to get your vSAN environment up and running.
Absolutely.
So we've covered exam details, VCF topologies, workload domains, vSAN design, and even ESXi design.
We've made some good progress.
And I think we're ready to move on to some of the other key components of VCF.
Let's do it.
All right, stay tuned. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the other important VCF components.
That's right.
Like vCenter server,
Yeah.
the heart of any vSphere environment.
It is absolutely essential.
But it seems like in VCF, we're not just deploying one vCenter, we're deploying many.
Yeah, that's right. Each workload domain needs its own dedicated vCenter server instance.
Okay, so that's definitely more complex than a traditional vSphere environment.
It is. You have to think about things like sizing and high availability for each of those vCenter instances.
Okay, so sizing, making sure each vCenter has enough resources. And high availability, meaning if one vCenter goes down, another one can take over.
That's right. You don't want any downtime for your vCenter servers.
What's the best way to protect those vCenter server appliances?
vSphere HA, it's the recommended way to make sure they're always available.
Okay, so vSphere HA is like an insurance policy for your vCenter servers.
You got it.
Now, speaking of clusters, let's talk about vSphere clusters themselves.
Okay, we've got a few options there.
Yeah, I remember we talked about stretched clusters before.
Stretched clusters, those are the ones that span 2 availability zones.
Right, so it's like having a cluster that lives in 2 data centers at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
And those are great for high availability, right?
Hey, absolutely. If one data center goes down, the other one can keep running.
Makes sense, but I imagine they're more complex to set up.
They are. You need to think about the networking and the storage.
And then you mentioned remote clusters, too.
Remote clusters, those are for geographically distant locations.
Okay, like a disaster recovery site.
Exactly. So if you need to have a copy of your data in another region, you can use a remote cluster.
Got it. But managing those clusters must be a challenge with all that distance.
It can be. You have to be very careful with your networking.
All right, now let's shift gears and talk about NSX, which is the networking piece of VCF.
NSX, it's a big topic.
Yeah, it can be pretty overwhelming.
So let's focus on the key things you need to know.
Okay, sounds good.
First, NSX Manager. That's the brain of your NSX environment.
Okay.
And the guide recommends deploying 3 NSX Manager nodes in the management domain.
3 nodes, so that's for high availability again.
Exactly. You want to make sure NSX Manager is always up and running.
Got it. And then there's NFX edge nodes, which I think handle the connectivity between the virtual network and the outside world.
That's right. They provide that north-south connectivity.
And you could deploy them as virtual appliances or on bare metal, right?
You can. Virtual appliances are easier to manage.
Yeah.
But bare metal can give you better performance.
So it's a trade-off again.
It always is.
All right, and then there's routing options in NSX.
Routing. Yeah, you can do static routing or dynamic routing with BGP.
I've heard of BGP. Isn't that what they use on the internet?
It is. It's a very powerful protocol.
Okay.
But it can be complex, so static routing might be a better choice for simply deployments.
Got it. So BGP for big and complex, static for small and simple.
That's a good way to remember it.
Awesome. Now let's talk about lifecycle management in VCF.
Lifecycle management, that's all about managing the different components of your VCF environment.
Okay, so things like deploying, patching, and upgrading.
Exactly.
Now, thankfully, SDDC Manager helps with a lot of that, right?
It does. It automates a lot of the tasks.
Okay, that's good news.
But there are some exceptions, like NSX Global Manager
Okay.
and Workspace ONE Access.
So we need to be aware of those and make sure we have a plan for managing them.
Absolutely.
All right, and then there's logging and monitoring. How do we keep track of everything that's happening in our VCF environment?
Well, the guide recommends using VMware Area Operations for logs.
Area operations for logs. It's part of the Area Suite.
It is.
And it collects logs from all the different VCF components.
That's right. It gives you a central place to view and analyze your logs.
Okay, so it's like a single pane of glass for all your logging needs.
Exactly.
Awesome. Now, what about security, especially with all these components and users?
Security is very important. You need to have strong password policies,
Okay.
regular password rotation, and you should use a centralized identity provider like Active Directory.
So it's all about following security best practices, just like we would in any other environment.
That's right.
Any other security tips from the guide?
Yes, you should replace the default certificates on all your management appliances with certificates signed by a trusted internal certificate authority.
Certificates. Okay, so that's to make sure the communication between VCF components is secure.
Exactly.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this section, from vCenter Server and vSphere clusters to NSX, lifecycle management, and security.
We have.
I'm feeling much more confident about that VCF architect exam now.
That's great to hear.
But there's still more to cover, right?
There is. In the next section, we're going to look at some specific design blueprints.
Design blueprints, okay.
These are practical examples of how to design VCF environments for different use cases.
Oh, that sounds really helpful, like seeing how all these concepts we've been talking about come together in a real-world scenario.
Exactly.
All right, I'm excited to see those. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back and ready to take a look at these VCF design blueprints.
Yes, the blueprints.
It's like we're getting a sneak peek at how real-world VCF environments are designed.
Yeah, it's a good way to put all these concepts we've talked about into practice.
Let's start with a simple one. What does a basic VCF deployment look like?
The guide has a blueprint for a single instance, single availability zone deployment.
Okay.
That's the simplest topology, good for smaller environments, or if you're just getting started with VCF.
All right, makes sense. So what are the key design elements for that kind of setup?
Well, you'd have a dedicated vCenter server instance for each workload domain, one for management and one for VI workload.
Okay, so 2 vCenters total.
That's right. And both of them would be protected by vSphere HA.
Of course. Got to have that high availability.
You'd use VSAN for storage.
Makes sense.
And you'd have a basic NSX configuration with a Tier 0 gateway for external connectivity and a Tier 1 gateway for the workload domain network.
Hold on. Tier 0 and Tier 1 gateways. Can you explain those really quick?
Sure. Think of gateways as entry and exit points for network traffic.
Okay.
The Tier 0 gateway is at the edge of your VCF environment. It handles all the traffic coming in and going out.
Right.
The Tier 1 gateway is inside the workload domain. It manages traffic between virtual machines within that domain.
Oh, I get it. So the Tier 0 gateway is like the front door to your house, and the Tier 1 gateway is like the door to your bedroom.
That's a good analogy.
So this basic single instance, single availability zone blueprint, it covers all the essentials.
It does.
But what if we need more availability? Like what if we can't afford any downtime?
Well, then you'd want to look at the single instance multi-availability zone blueprint.
Okay.
This one uses stretched clusters for both the management and VI workload domains.
Stretched clusters. We talked about those. It's like having a backup data center, right?
Yeah, if one site goes down, the other site can take over.
That's awesome. But I bet it's more complicated.
It is. You have to think about the distance between the sites, the network latency, and the storage replication.
So it's a trade-off. More availability, but more complexity.
That's right.
Okay, so what other blueprints are there?
The guide also has blueprints for multi-instance deployments.
Okay.
These are for large organizations that need to scale their VCF environment across multiple sites.
So instead of one big VCF environment, you have multiple smaller ones.
Yeah, it's like having multiple VCF data centers.
That's wild. What are the benefits of that kind of setup?
Well, if one instance fails, the others can keep running, so it's
Right.
more resilient. And it's easier to scale because you can just add more instances as you need them.
Makes sense. So it's like having multiple engines on an airplane. If one fails, the others can keep you flying.
Exactly. It's all about redundancy.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So it seems like these blueprints cover a lot of different scenarios.
They do, from simple to complex.
And there's no one right answer. It depends on your needs.
Absolutely. You have to consider your requirements for availability, scale, complexity, and budget.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a light bulb.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We started with the exam guide, then we went through all the key components of VCF, and now we've even looked at some real-world design blueprints.
And hopefully you're feeling more prepared for the VCF 5.2 architect exam.
I definitely am. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that you have to keep learning.
Absolutely. This field is always changing.
So never stop being curious, and don't be afraid to experiment.
That's the best way to master VCF.
Great advice. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, good luck on your exam. We're sure you'll do great.
Best of luck.
Until next time, keep diving deep.